Yo, welcome to my place. I'm your host, American Warhorse. Thank you for stopping by and spending some time with me. Well, here it is. It's October and we're in the midst of the baseball playoffs. October is a particularly memorable time for me. See this ball? 4 years ago this weekend, on Sunday, October the 11th, I participated by pure random chance in a 3-game, 6-team vintage baseball tournament in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. It was sponsored by the Strasburg Railroad. I received this game ball for game 2 of the tournament. I went 3 for 3 at the plate, had 2 RBIs and 3 putouts. I also received as a gift from the team this bat, which I used that day. I had a great time. What is vintage baseball, you ask? Well, it's playing by the old rules of the 1800s. Look it up. There are several full-fledged vintage baseball leagues around the United States, but particularly in Maryland and in Pennsylvania. The regional league here is the Mid-Atlantic Vintage Baseball League, and folks go all out, even dressing the part like it was on the day of the tournament. And let me tell you, the real working steam locomotive in the background, which used restored coaches, which we rode out to the tournament, it really did feel like I stepped back in time 125 years. Oh, by the way, the scratch team I was on won the tournament. Here is a picture of the trophy bat. And here's a picture of the team I played for. Now, if it looks like I'm out of place, you're right. The organizers asked a bunch of us onlookers if anybody wanted to play in the tournament because they were actually short of a couple of players. Well, those of you who know me personally can figure out that me volunteering to play baseball was a foregone conclusion. Yep, that was a very memorable October. But there's an October in baseball history which will live in infamy, to turn a phrase. Let's go back to October of 1919 and what became known in history as the Chicago Black Sox scandal. But before we do, I'd like for you to open your Bibles and place the markers in the following passages. Proverbs 15, verse 27, Exodus 20, verse 15 and 17, and 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 3. Now, in case you're not familiar with the Black Sox scandal, let me give you a little background so you can have some context. The team I'm talking about is actually the Chicago White Sox, the very same organization that plays today. In 1919, they were, to use a phrase that was popular in those days, a lead pipe cinch to win the World Series. The team had an incredible array of talent for the time. Shoeless Joe Jackson was arguably the best hitter in baseball. Pitchers Eddie Chicote and Claude Lefty Williams were virtually unhittable. First baseman Arnold Chick Gandil, shortstop Charles Swede Riceberg, along with Jackson, was some of the most sure-handed players on the team. Their opponents for the series were the Cincinnati Reds. Now, they were a good team, but nowhere near the caliber of the White Sox. Now, in those days, professional ball players didn't make a whole lot of money. In fact, all the ball players had regular jobs during the offseason to make ends meet. The owner of the White Sox, Charles Comiskey, who had once been a player himself, was known as a miser when it came to paying his players, even though his team was one of the top moneymakers in the league. As you can guess, this created a lot of resentment with the team. On top of that, all of the team owners in baseball had built into a player's contract what was known as the reserve clause. What this meant was that a player could not negotiate with another team for his services. The team he played for had the right to reserve him for the upcoming season. So unless he got traded to another team or was released outright from his contract, a player had very few options. One was to sit out a year, thus automatically releasing him from his contract, or two, holding out for more money. And in those days, that was financial suicide. And it wasn't just baseball that had the reserve clause. All of professional sports, including the NFL and hockey, had some form of the reserve clause. And it wasn't until 1975 that it was abolished altogether in baseball. But I digress. Now let's understand something. Sports and gambling have always been a part of each other. It goes on even today. In those days in particular, players who weren't paid very well or were disgruntled about their contracts were ripe for the picking. Gamblers would pay for information on who was hurt or who was going through a personal problem which might affect his playing ability. Anything to give them an edge when it came to making money. But until 1919, nobody had ever tried to rig an entire World Series. A very complicated scheme was concocted by Gandil and a professional gambler named Joe Sullivan for key members of the team to aid in losing the series, which in those days was a 9-game affair rather than the 7 it is today. The payoff would be $100,000 in total for the players involved. Now, for 1919, that's an enormous sum. Sullivan got other gangsters involved, including New York mob leader Arnold Rothstein. Meanwhile, it was Gandil's job to recruit the key players. On October the 1st, at the start of Game 1, Eddie Cicotte hit the very first batter with a pitch. That was a signal to the gamblers that the fix was in. During the game and the series, the White Sox players made a series of highly questionable errors. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. By October the 6th, with the Reds leading the series 4-1, some of the White Sox players began getting restless. See, the gamblers had promised that after each loss, they would pay the players $20,000. Well, needless to say, no money was paid. So the White Sox players decided they were going to win the series. As you can guess, it doesn't take a genius to know you just don't double-cross gangsters. In the trial that would follow this scandal, several of the players who were involved hinted that harm would come to either them or their families if they didn't follow through. Long story short, the Reds eventually won the series. Now, in 1920, there was a famous trial held against the players, who were now known as the Black Sox. However, even though they were indicted by the grand jury, under extremely mysterious circumstances, the prosecutor's grand jury testimony notes disappeared. Many attribute this to the gangster Arnold Rothstein, who had connections with the prosecutor's office and also the police department, although it could never be proven. The players on trial were eventually acquitted on the 9 specific charges of racketeering and other charges, but there was enormous fallout which went far beyond these men. Fallout which would have effects for years afterwards. Because baseball's image was now tarnished, the owners of the various teams were left scrambling to fix things. Attendance fell off substantially, which affected every team's bottom line. It remained that way for years until the arrival of a man named George Herman Ruth, better known as the Sultan of SWAT, the Bambino, or simply the Babe. Baseball historians widely credit him as single-handedly saving baseball. But that's a story for another time. However, there was a much more dubious event which followed that scandal, one which stole the dreams of many of a player of color. You see, in order to show that baseball was played on the level, the owners eventually appointed a retired federal judge named Kennesaw Mountain Landis. This man was given absolute and total control over professional baseball as the very first commissioner. His first act was to ban all 8 players involved in the scandal from baseball for life, which is still enforced to this day. For instance, Joe Jackson, who has Hall of Fame worthy statistics, was never enshrined. But even more prominent was the decision made by Judge Landis to bar men of color from playing at the major or minor league levels. This act led directly to the strengthening of what was known as the Negro National League, as well as several other baseball leagues for players of color. Many of the players in those leagues were as good, if not arguably better, than players in Major League Baseball. Men like Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, Martin El Maestro Dihigo, Rube Foster, Cool Papa Bell, Oscar Charleston, and a host of others played some of the finest baseball of the era. Now, Black and Latino men had played pro baseball before 1919, but after that decision by Landis, no others would play until Jackie Robinson of the Brooklyn Dodgers and Larry Doby of the Cleveland Indians came along. In the words of Judge Landis, no coloreds would play in the major leagues as long as he had something to say about it. Except he didn't use the word coloreds. Get my meaning? As for the White Sox players who were involved in the scandal, well, they never got their money. So it was all for nothing. Greed and covetousness got the better of them. Now, let's read those scripture passages, if you would, please. We're going to start with Proverbs 15, verse 27. And I'll be reading from the New King James. He who is greedy for gain troubles his own house, but he who hates bribes will live. Now on to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 3. This particular passage talks about false doctrine, but it can be just as easily applied to this particular situation. By covetousness, they will exploit you with deceptive words. For a long time, their judgment has not been idle, and their destruction does not slumber. And finally, Exodus 20, verses 15 and 17. You shall not steal. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Covetousness in this case led to the downfall of the players and the team. Now, why did I mention thou shalt not steal? In my view, it's simple. You see, like I said before, I think dreams were stolen. The chance for young men of all races, creeds, and colors to come together and play a game was stolen from them. And the chance to see great ball players of color was stolen from fans of the game. I'm sure you can come up with even more reasons than I can. As for the 10th commandment, covetousness is more than wanting something which isn't yours. It's wanting something so badly, you'd risk everything to attain it. And in the case of the Chicago White Sox players of 1919, their greed got the better of them, and they paid a heavy price. But so did others who came along after them. I hope you enjoyed yourself today. If you liked what you heard, please like, share, and touch that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Oh, one more thing. I'd like you to go and touch the subscription button for the following folks, if you would, please. They are DM, Disabled Vets Perspective, Charity O, History B, Sandra Ann McGibbon, Rye Girl, The R-Rated Conservative, and CLC in Florida. You'll find their links in the description box, if I don't mess that up. They're good people to know, and I know they'll appreciate it. So until next time, may God bless you. Have a great week, and keep the faith.